Welcome everyone to the IFS Down Under podcast, where we have deep conversations with leaders in the IFS space and honour and share the stories of homegrown Australian IFS therapists and practitioners. I'm Oliver Brooke, and I'm here today with my co-host, Suzanne Herrity. Welcome, Suzanne.
Thanks, Ollie.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's good to be with you again.
Yeah, it's good to be with you too.
Yeah. Today, Suzanne and I have the pleasure of interviewing Australian IFS therapist and psychologist Heidi Lethbridge. Suzanne and I first met Heidi in 2021 during our IFS Level 1 training with senior IFS lead trainers Enat Bronstein and Paul Ginter. Heidi is the daughter of a German woman and an Aboriginal man. In 1968, her birth parents were denied permission to marry by the Australian government, which at the time required Aboriginal people to seek approval to marry. Soon after, Heidi's mother moved to Tasmania and gave birth to her. And afterwards, Heidi was adopted and raised by an English family. Heidi is now a mother herself and works as a registered psychologist living in Uluru, Tasmania. She holds a bachelor's degree in psychology and an applied degree in community psychology. Heidi spent the last 12 years in the counselling team at the Aboriginal Health Service in Tasmania. Recently, Heidi became the statewide manager of the Culture Care Connect program, a national Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander program specialising in suicide prevention. Culture Care and Connect is a community initiative funded by the federal government and is delivered through the National Aboriginal Community Controlled Network. This means it's community controlled, designed and delivered. The aim of Culture Care Connect is to reduce Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander suicide rates across this country to zero. Heidi completed her IFS Institute Level 1 training alongside Suzanne and I in Australia with senior IFS trainers Paul Ginter and Enat Bronstein in 2021. And Heidi is also the recipient of the Senior Indigenous Higher Degree Research Scholarship through the University of Tasmania. Heidi's research focuses on applying internal family systems to the country of Australia as if Australia was a person. Heidi wanted to see if the IFS framework that heals exiled pain within the individual could help release the exiled people of this country, the Aboriginal people. Welcome, Heidi. It's so good to have you with us today.
Hi, guys. Thanks.
Yeah.
Welcome,
Thanks.
Heidi.
It's great to be here.
Yeah.
Thanks, Susan.
Great to have you.
An amazing glimpse.
Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, so welcome. Amazing glimpse into kind of who you are, Heidi. Thank you for sharing that information with us. And I was wondering, in our IFS training, there was a moment where you gave us a welcome to country for all of the participants on the training, and it was a really beautiful welcome to country that I'd never heard before from kind of an IFS lens. And I wondered if you could please honour this kind of conversation today with a welcome to country for us all.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ollie. I've just rehashed what we did in 2021, which was a little bit around the NAIDOC theme. So for 2021, which was Heal the Country.
Great.
So I'll do that again.
Yeah.
So before I do the welcome country, I wanted to start with a reflective piece. Considering that we're all IFS therapists, an informed group of practitioners listening, I reckon, I'd first like to get us to reflect honest about Australia from an IFS lens. Aboriginal people see country as person. And so that was in line with the NAIDOC theme, Heal Country. And for those who don't know what NAIDOC is, it's a National Aboriginal Islander Day of Commission that's done every year, and it always has a theme. So the 2021 theme of Heal Country calls for us all to continue to seek greater protection for our lands, our waters, our sacred sites, and our cultural heritage from exploitation, desecration, and destruction. Country that is more than a place inherent to our identity. Country that we speak about like a person, sustaining our lives in every aspect, spiritually, physically, emotionally, socially, and culturally. I wish to quote some of this year's statements of 2021. Country is inherent to our identity. Again, it stains our lives in all aspects, spiritually, physically, emotionally, and socially. It's more than a place. And when we talk about country, it is spoken of like a person. Country is family, kin, law, ceremony, traditions, and language. For Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, it has been this way since the time of dawn. Through our language, our songs, we speak to country. Through our ceremonies and our traditions, we sing to country and celebrate country, and country speaks to us. Increasingly, we worry about country. Now, from an Indigenous perspective, I want you to look at Australia as a person, like Aboriginal people do. Australia is a very young country or person. Some Aboriginal people say Australia is like a toddler, we're 2 years old. In relation to Aboriginal people to Australia, it is clear that Aboriginal people have been exiled from this nation. And so just one stat or symptom of this is that Aboriginal Australians are the most incarcerated people on the planet. And I wish for you to think about what manager parts Australia has that keeps Aboriginal people exiled. And what firefighter parts does Australia have that are used to keep Aboriginal people exiled in their own country? I wonder if you could reflect on how Australia could access self. So from self, Australia could be able to witness and feel the pain of the exiled traditional owners of this land in which we all sit. The Australia could unburden the manager's parts, and the firefighter parts would no longer be needed. And then Aboriginal people could be released and healed. And I wonder, and maybe you do too, that the new role these parts of Australia would take on if it was no longer burdened with the fear of its Aboriginal people, what would that look like? So with that, I first wish to acknowledge and welcome any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person here today listening, and any First Nations person all over the world. I also ask that you reflect and acknowledge the traditional owners of the nation and lands you sit on today, and pay respect to all the elders, past and present, from the country you're from.
Powerful. Thank you so much, Heidi, for sharing that. Welcome to country for us.
Thank
It's
you,
okay.
Heidi.
Yeah. Yeah.
So do you want to talk about what that brings up
Yeah.
for you
Sure.
guys when you...
Yeah.
Yeah, the first thing that I notice for me is like a welling up of grief. And it kind of starts in the bottom of my stomach and slowly kind of makes its way up to my heart. And, you know, as you were kind of sharing that perspective of Australia as a country and as a person, and that Aboriginal people see country as person. And the damage that we've done to our country in some ways, and the exiling of certain people, Aboriginal people in this country. Yeah, there's a real grief that I feel about that, and that comes up as you talk about that. And then the other thing that comes up is the hope, and it kind of comes over my shoulders like a light. That is there's such a hopeful message in what you're saying as well. That actually, you know, as a system, as a being, Australia has a way forward that you've just hinted at and suggested, that we could open our hearts, that we could access self as a country and be united in some way. So yeah, those are the two senses I get, kind of this grief and this hope. Yeah.
Yeah, for me, I had a very, very somatic response to your words, Heidi. I noticed that when you were speaking of referring to Australia as person, the way I felt the wave of emotion move through me, and I noticed tears in the back of my eyes, and yeah, just I guess holding a bit of sadness of the history. Being originally from Ireland and living in Australia for over a decade, I feel very privileged to be on this land, and yet hold that my own history of my own land, and how that connects to and disconnects me from where I am. And then to hear you speak about, Australia from with Aboriginal people, and looking at it from an IFS lens, and yeah, just the weight of that, the weight of the history really hit me. And I can even feel right now talking about it, it's still quite a, emotional for me. And just the idea of having more self, infused into culture, into the country, and what the possibilities of what could happen if there was more of that. Yeah, and I'm just sitting with that, and yeah, sitting with the impact that it's had on me as an immigrant as well. Yeah. So really appreciate your words. Thank you. Mm.
I really don't know how we find self in this country, though, really.
Mm.
It was part of that led me to do the masters that I'm looking at, which is a bit of that framework, seeing IFS as that framework wouldn't that be great to help the exiled people in Australia, which are not just Aboriginal people, but my focus is on Aboriginal people, which are the major exiled. And the statement from the heart was like a self, I felt.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Yeah, it comes out in moments, and that definitely seems like one of them. The Uluru Statement from the heart.
Yeah.
And if it's
So,
okay, we'll get into that more in a little while,
okay.
if we can. But before that, if we could kind of go back a little bit before you told us that welcome to country in the IFS training, I'd really like to hear, how did you first discover IFS, and how did IFS become a part of your kind of personal healing journey? Because you've been through a lot, and it was kind of hinted at in your bio. So yeah, could you tell us a bit about that, Heidi?
Yeah. I was doing, I did a psychology degree, and then did the 4+2 in training. And so I was a professional psychologist. And during those 2 years, which I did over part-time, 4 years, you have to complete certain modules and look at certain therapies. And during that time, I worked with a colleague who kept saying to me, internal family systems, you'll love it. And I'm like, I have to do CBT, I have to do DBT, I'm doing narrative therapy, I'm looking at motivated interview, I'm looking at assessments and interventions. I had so much I had to cover to tick off. I'll do it. And she's like, yeah, after you finish, kind of thing. But what ended up happening, I'd just finished, and I'd done lots of work on myself through therapy as well. And it's probably what led me to work with people, as is what we've all done. And I knew I had pre-verbal parts because of just my world. And so I wanted to go and do EMDR, which I'm not trained in either. So I go off and find my own therapist who and waited ages to get into her. She was a psychologist who's EMDR trained. And the first session, she sits me down and we talk about, and she asked me why I wanted to do EMDR stuff. And I said, it's pre-verbal stuff. I know, but I don't know. I can't get to it. And then she said, oh, have you heard of IFS? And I said, oh, and I smiled and said, yeah, I've heard of it. I've had a colleague say for years I should look at it. Who at that time, she wasn't actually trained. This woman then says, I just did an introduction course on it. Just so she did a 2-day or 3-day introduction course that our education department must have ran, I think. And she said, but I just want to explain it to you. And she explained about the parts and the frames and protector and manager and just the basic model. And then she said she likes to pair that stuff with EMDR, because if you get to pre-verbal parts,
Mm.
it's really nice to know, if through EMDR, it's nice to know what your parts are around. So sometimes with pre-verbal, parts can get in the way and we wouldn't know, kind of thing. And I'm like, oh, whatever that means, kind of thing. So then she took me inside and started to look at the parts, and I just left that session. I'm a visual, I didn't know this, but I'm a visual person. So when I go inside and see parts, I see amazing stuff. And that introduced me to it. I mean, I did kind of know I was visual because I did a fine arts degree where I do paint stuff, and so I literally left that session thinking, oh my God, this is just walking back to work. This is just so Indigenous. I just saw Indigenous arts and parts and how it all connects. And I thought of my clients I was already working with, thinking, we already talk parts. Like, it was just like this introduction, blown away. And I remember going back and seeing my work colleague going, IFS. She said, I've been saying it for years. I knew you'd like it. I knew it would ring with you. And then I didn't have another session with that woman for ages because COVID hit. I had 3 kids. I kept them home. I chose to stay home for 6 months. They told us every Aboriginal person over 50 shouldn't go out. We were treated as though we were like 65-year-olds. So I went, okay. And then I blitzed on it. I did every podcast I could find. I read everything off the net. I ordered some books from the Institute. And then I did a session with that same psychologist about 3 months later and said what I'd done. And she was laughing, saying, you know way more about it than me now. But I still didn't really know about it because I was, blindly following. So that was my introduction to how I found it. And then I desperately wanted to do that level 1 training. So, and I tried to get in one in earlier on, while it was COVID, actually in 2020, and there was no spots left. And so I begged and struggled. And then because it's so expensive, when I started my master's and I'm doing this framework, they offered to pay for half of it as part of the master's, because it was around the framework. So that's where I went from that image to, I'm going to write about this. So, and then of course I did my own internal family systems therapy. But again, like, it's Stephanie Mitchell, she's from South Australia and she's level 3 trained, one of our most trained in Australia. I think one of the first, actually, been trained by Dick and knows all those guys. And I cannot spout, she's amazing. Someone for you to interview, actually, maybe, if she wants to. She's like, I contacted her about some IFS stuff and she's like, oh, hang on. She could see that I really needed to do some IFS therapy. So after our training, we buddied up with people and I did a few. But in all that time, I didn't have any money. I couldn't afford. That was been a big thing for me. I actually couldn't afford to have IFS therapy. And so Stephanie just knew that. And she was wanting to help me support with some of the clients. And she said, look, one of the best things you can do is actually be a client. And she offered me very cheaply about 8 or 10 sessions. I can't remember exactly. And we did that quite, she had a space of time. She's fairly booked, but I think we did about 6 in a row for 6 weeks. And that was just fantastic. And then she offered me the most amazing thing. She was part of the IFS circle, the online circle. And every second month, Dick Schwartz does a live demo, and she wanted to see if she was going to put my name forward as a live demo. And I just was like, what, with him? No way. And then I went, oh, okay, you've got to be in these things to win them. Who knows? And then we got picked, which was an absolute blow away. And I did a session with Dick that was absolutely life-changing. And it was just amazing. And so I feel very honored by that. And then I got into the IFS training after that. And then that same thing happened. I have got a supervisor now, Emma Diamond, through work. Once a month we use Emma. But then 2022, I had a lot of stuff happen. I had a very sick child they found a tumor inside his heart in his left atriums, and he's only 17. And so we had to do open heart surgery, and that was really touch and go. So it was my year of 2022 was blown out. Again, not at work much, no money. And I don't know how Simon someone knew that I really probably could do with some therapy. And I also then got Emma Diamond accessed me and said they had some funding out of New South Wales to offer some
Wow.
discounted sessions. So I then started again doing IFS therapy with Emma fortnightly. It was fortnightly for a while. So that also is my other angle to it. But it's been a thing, and I hunted the list to try and find psychologists so I could get the mental health care plan, because I really wanted my son to do some ISS therapy, and there wasn't any in Tasmania he'd do in person. But that's so hard to find. Otherwise it's like 130, 180 bucks.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
anyway, that's my story of how I found it, and I love it.
Yeah.
And I do feel,
Yeah.
the other thing I really feel though is I'm a Christian, and so when I started going into this started being a spiritual field, I started thinking, how does that all connect in the beginning? And then there's a whole area of lots of spiritual people in different areas that take on IFS, and there's heaps of prominent books and people written on Christianity within the IFS framework. And so I do feel a bit directed that way, that it was given to me that way too. So that's an experience of that side, the spiritual side of it. But anyway.
What a journey you've had so far, Heidi.
Oh.
What a journey. And I'm really curious about working in the Aboriginal Health Service and how you've integrated IFS,
Yeah.
how you've done that.
Well, it's really interesting. Like you guys, you do the training, and then I come back to work, and I had another 6 months of work before I took time off again, with my clients that I'd already worked with who knew nothing about IFS. And all I'd practice with was people who know IFS. And they knew a way I'd worked. When I had new clients start, it was much easier, but because I've got that other paradigm I've trained in, I found it quite clunky. Whereas before, I've naturally got a way of connecting with people, and in my therapy I'd use different models and frameworks. And so I have found it tricky. And then I hear that you IFS therapists, lots of you have gone off and now you're running it fully that way, and I'm like, oh, I wouldn't have had the confidence to do that. Which is really interesting. But yeah, but it works well. Like, as I said, people just they talk parts anyway, and like, it's how I saw it. And some of my new clients, I was sort of reflecting, and the younger new ones seem so much easier to talk into the parts, and I get them to go in, and then because I'm visual, I get them to explain when they're finding something. And a couple of new ones will find images, and then they'll talk about different parts, and then they'll come back. And there was one girl that I had, and I had to say to her, because I told her about it, I said, have you been reading this? Like, she was so textbop. And she hadn't read anything or listened to anything. But she was that was powerful. But yeah, so I did. I think, and I had heard, if you're trained in other modalities, sometimes it is clunky.
Yeah.
To try and switch across. But
Yeah.
when I relax, I also practice on a few friends outside, not work-wise, at the beginning, and I found that much easier too, in a way. But I find it when I do sessions with people that are IFS trained, which is the worker here now, and we just flow. But I think it is easier once someone's very knowledgeable, or they have self, I think. Maybe I'm running into lots of parts. I am running into lots of parts. And so I suppose I do use direct access a lot more with clients that are really, some of them I realized I decided less to talk about the model in my head, get that pit art, but in my head I was talking to the part. So I'll talk to the paranoid part and not actually call it a part to begin with, and wondering what it's protecting them, and and that seemed to work with some complex clients actually, because it threw them if I kind of tried to bring in the part of you and try and locate it and flesh it. I just located it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then,
that
of course,
makes sense. Yeah.
and now I've stepped into this new role, and this has also been a bit more powerful, because when we work at the Aboriginal Health Service, we referred from people from everywhere, so anything walks through the door. But now I've realised, actually, which I'm excited about, is because it's in suicide prevention, and it's aftercare work. It's meant to be working with people who have attempted suicide or have suicide thoughts. So what walks through the door is the suicide part. So we already know that. And with the clients I have worked with, pre being in this role, if they've had a suicide part, I find that much easier to work with, actually, to be honest. Anyway, so now I guess it's a natural progression too. And so then because of that model, I've been trying to look at some national training, or there's just nothing. So talking with Emma Diamond, I think we're going to design and start training a package that will help with workers working in that field in an IFS framework. So working with suicide parts, which is very different. Like with the psychology framework, you contract and you say you're not going to do this, and we make a plan and a risk assessment. With one experience I had is a person who I won't say the gender, had suicide parts and had attempted and had. And so when I was working internal, we'd explored the parts that were protective inside. And there was a writing part. And we explored that writing part was what reminded her. And so then the suicide part would get a bit annoyed at the writing part, because the writing part would stop her from taking a life or taking the tablets. And so in a way, when we opened those parts up, that was the protective plan. And so then we were working with this person, and the mother contacts and saying, I've worked through schools, and where's the risk assessment plan? We need to sign it. And I'm thinking, how do I tell her I've got like a safety plan? Because she was talking about safety plan, safety plan that's actually internal, without explaining the whole. So we did have a safety plan, an internal safety plan. Anyway,
and Heidi, for a moment, could you, for our listeners, could you just give them the IFS perspective on working with suicidal parts? Because some people might not have heard it before, especially for people who haven't done the level 1. Could you just give us a little overview of the different perspective? Because I know the mainstream kind of medical model and psychological model is to do risk assessments and those kind of things. And could you just give the IFS perspective?
Okay, I'll give it how I've worked it. So I don't necessarily, because I had a podcast and blitzed and tried to find much on it, and there's actually not a lot. There's a couple of podcasts that talk about it. So say with a person I've got, I might have them in the car. I'm just thinking that as a memory. So you get them they've had a suicide attempt. So, and we know this part. And so I say to them, we got to do the 5 Fs. You find that part. So you find where they locate it. And if they've never had anything to do with IFS, it's a bit like, what do you mean? I said, where do you feel it? Sit with that part, think about the suicide part. And so they do. And then you sort of, do they feel it in your heart? Or they might say their head or in their stomach. And so what's it feel like? So you flesh it out. Does it have a color? Does it have an image? You sort of, I've explored it with, how long's it been around for? When did it first arrive? And they'll go back in the years and identify it. So we make a relationship with that suicide part. And then you can eventually, and then you go, get into part. I haven't unburdened a suicide part yet personally myself, but it's a bit like, what's it afraid of would happen if it doesn't take you out? If it doesn't kill you, what's it afraid of? And it's like it just continuing feeling the same way I feel. And then you explore, and usually the suicide part tends to not want to kill a person. It wants to stop the feeling they're feeling. And it's stopping the feeling they're feeling. And then from work I've done with that part, and so we're moving towards it with love, and curiosity and compassion, trying to get into the self. And trying to ask those questions. And some they'll say they're ashamed of it. Shame's been a big one that's come through them. Not necessarily scared of it, but you could have scared of it parts, and you sort of asking them to step aside. To somebody who's not IFS, that's really tricky when you're in the zone, I find. Can you step it aside? And it's like, what? And I just sort of sit that part there and I acknowledge it. That's how it's worked for me. And then other parts come up. It's like, well, when you've been in that state, what's happened? Well, say the writing part one, it's like, well, I write farewell letters. And so then we explore the farewell part letter and everything that comes up in that. And then we explore that protects her. And then she feels, he feels really soft towards that part. And so then, okay, when that part feels, when you get that feeling coming up and that other part comes in, move towards the other part, you sort of, and as you're doing this with a person, what you're doing is you're unblending them from the suicide part.
Mm.
So
Mhm.
other work you find within that, I've found within that, is when you're looking at the suicide part, you can see that it's always there, but a person might take on something that they do, a drug of any sorts, and whilst they're under that influence, they realise all the protective parts disappear. And so then that suicide part becomes so loud and overwhelms that that's when they attempt. So then the
Mhm.
person looking internal into their own system can work out, my biggest risk is that,
Ah.
the
Mm.
Yeah.
addiction or the what they're, and so, and or being alone, and so, and not taking the step. And so, you know, the hope is you unblend them from that overwhelming part that's taking them over at the time.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, and and then you do have that old training where it goes, oh, you know, if I talk to them about it, does it bring it on? Does it mean they're going to turn more towards it? Is it more likely to take their life? Are they more, you know, all that fear that comes with
Mhm.
that? And there's
Mhm.
the safety plan and the, you're not going to do it, are you? And
Yeah.
Yeah.
as soon as you tell
There's
something it's not going to happen, that's tricky.
there's the
Yeah.
manager response to it, right? Trying to control it and bury it and
Yes,
make
that's
sure it
the word.
doesn't
Thank you.
happen and things
Mhm.
like that.
Yeah.
Whereas what I'm hearing you're saying is this really different approach, which is actually in turning towards that suicidal part, in relating to them and connecting to them and understanding them, that there's a softening. And also there's, and
Yeah.
then you see what other parts are connected to them and how do they
Yeah.
actually get to the point where they want to do that. And you
Yeah.
start to kind of discover that, and with the person, they get a bit of space and a bit of separation, you know, what we say in IFS, unblending, so that they can
Yeah.
actually start to be with that part and not real and realize that that's not all of who they are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mm.
I mean, you guys probably would have come across that in your work. I don't know, but
Yeah.
my field will become specialized in that anyway.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely have come across it, and I've worked in a similar way to what you've done. But I've also had training in the older approach. Well, actually, it's still a current approach, the current approach of risk
Mm.
assessment and of safety plans and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm. Yeah. I've had similar too, you know, that idea of safety plans and, you know, agreeing that people are going to keep themselves safe and then having people in the room with suicidal parts. Yeah. And noticing in people as well that when you invite it and welcome it in, how that really softens their system.
Yeah.
Somebody is willing to actually be with them in this.
Yeah.
Yeah. Rather than, you know, making sure that they don't do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
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 I've noticed with a
Mm.
few of the young people I've talked towards about their suicide or their self-harming parts.
Yeah.
It's sometimes it really has felt like they've sat up in the room, that part, and
Yeah.
off they go.
Mm.
And it is a bit like no one's ever asked me about that.
Yeah.
Mm.
And
Mm.
it
Yeah.
is where you really go, whoa, okay, and you really
Mm.
notice. But in
Mm.
that, it is a softening because it's a move towards with love. That's my thing about
Yeah.
this model. It's
Yeah.
Yeah.
that heals.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Move towards with love. It heals that which you don't like.
Yeah.
So,
Mm.
and I have heard, I was given this bit of information that sometimes suicide parts will sit there. These are people who
Mm.
have done IFS for a long time, and it then becomes their warning bell. Because the suicide part, feeling like not wanting to be here, pops up before you might notice all the overwhelm around you. And so
Mm-hmm.
then you build up a relationship with that part of yourself going, ah, thanks. Thanks for letting me
Mm.
know what's going on in my
Mm.
system. Right.
Mm-hmm.
This means
Yeah.
I've got to step back or I've got to take more notice.
Yeah.
Mm.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like
Yeah.
the final firefighter, right? Like
Yeah, it's the
suicide
ultimate,
is
isn't it?
Mm.
the ultimate
Yeah.
firefighter and take away all of the pain. So
Oh,
that's such a great
yeah.
indicator that things are overwhelmed, things are too
Mm-hmm.
much for this system. And so
I
listening to that.
always, yeah. What's his name? Who's the psychologist who brought mindfulness to America? I always want to say his name and I forget. Anyway, he's a Buddhist guy.
John Kabat-Zinn?
No, not John Kabat-Zinn,
No.
but he's like him. But he's
Adyashanti?
no, he was Ram Dass's best mate. So, it'll come to me. Anyway, he says, he does a beautiful interview, and he says from a Buddhist perspective about suicide, in a way, the person's got it right. Something's got to die, but it's not the body. It's just not the body. And from a Buddhist perspective, I mean, killing something's wrong. Creating more suffering is not okay. So taking out the body is really not okay. But something in the person has to die. And from that IFS lens and what I've watched, it's that feeling, it's that thing that makes them feel crap, or that reason they really don't think they're valuable or want to be here. And I guess the ultimate is to get to the exile in an IFS perspective and have it witnessed.
Yeah, so it's the burden that needs to die. It's not the part. It's the burden they're holding of worthlessness or hopelessness or deep shame or something along those lines. That's the thing that can be healed and witnessed and released. Yeah, I really like what you're saying about that.
Yeah, wish I could remember the guy's name. Everyone knows him.
Yeah,
Anyway.
I'm blanking, but I sort of think
we'll remember later.
I know.
Of course, we'll remember later.
I could Google it.
Ron Kurtz keeps popping into my mind, but I'm pretty sure he's the Hakomi guy.
He is the Hakomi guy.
Yeah. Heidi, I wonder
Yeah.
if we could just backtrack for a moment. You mentioned a really profound experience that you had, and I just want to ask you a little bit more about it. Which is this moment with Dick Schwartz.
Oh, yeah.
And you know, having listened to so many of his talks and trainings and things, but it's all been online, and I've never met the man. But it does seem that when he sits with people that he's never met before, and that he knows nothing about their story even, he just immediately gets them to go inside and do these processes, and they have these profound experiences, you know, within like 20, 30 minutes. And so I just wanted to ask you, like specifically, what was it like to just be with him as a client in that session? And how did it differ from your work with Stephanie, your work with Emma?
Yeah. What was it like? At first, very nerve-wracking, because it was like the whole world is a training thing. And of course, I suppose I'm in awe in a weird way. My system responded in awe weirdly, even though, because I know, you know, I don't know the man, but I know I studied it and was brilliant. But there was this really beautiful peace and presence, and all I can guess from an IFS perspective framework is he was in self so much. And my system, and he's so confident with the model. It's I don't know whether it was the confidence my system really trusted. And it's a little bit like, so yeah, when I try and, I guess most people were listening to this know IFS, so I was trying to word it a bit so maybe people who don't know IFS kind of get it, maybe they won't. But when he goes into your system and tries to locate the self energy and asks about the parts, it really felt like two things. The other parts coming in would stand up, and either steps fall away, and the other thing he could do was notice parts when they came in that I wouldn't have even known were a part. And then they'd sit in a room. He'd ask them to go into a room to watch. He'd ask them to step back. And all these things would just fall away. And it wouldn't, with working with Stephanie, we couldn't get into the same depth. We were working more with the manager parts and things that were kept getting in the way. I just can't explain. And then she watched that, and that was part of her thing. He was able to take me straight back to an image of myself as a baby wrapped in a blanket, probably the day of my adoption. And what my big sense was I couldn't connect. I was not connected to that baby. He brought me closer and closer to the baby, made me spend time with the baby, got the baby to open up its eyes and connect, and it didn't even know it could do that. And then we connected and that I think was it was profound. Whereas, because I think what had happened in my system, and which brings me back to why I went to EMDR unknowns, is as soon as I was adopted, which was about 6 weeks, between 4 and 6 weeks, I think self disappeared and I developed a part straight away, if that makes sense. Because I knew through IFS when it's like, but that's not self. It's like early in the piece, and you go, what do you mean it's not self? Like, I was locating self is hard. I had obviously developed from a very young age parts that were self-like part, but wasn't self. So I had no trust of self. And I think him bringing me back, and what I wrote was, it was like he showed me how to nurture and love and connect to a baby, which was me. And I couldn't know, I didn't know how to do it because no one had showed me. And so that's why it was for me, a beautiful, profound, moving session. I just, when we went in and we went right to that space of me reconnecting to me, I presume he was doing some of that work, but it felt like he was showing me how to do that. And then that's been magic. And really interestingly, I think he went to go and do an unburden. I kind of, from some reason, as the little baby there, and something happened, it jumped to a 6 or 7-year-old image when he went to, which I now have read is not uncommon actually, but I found at the time really weird. And we unburdened a 6 or 7-year-old and we witnessed a story on a boat, which I 3/4 remembered, of a man stealing I have 3 siblings and there were 4 of us on a boat. And I believed that he'd taken us down to a base cabin and was going to do something really bad. My sister believed, they're older than me. And we ran and took off, and there was fear that he'd held me over the side on the boat and my sister was petrified. He was a worker of the ship. This is the story I remembered, but I can't really remember the story. But when he unwitnessed that fear I had, there was a fear that he'd gone, and we witnessed that. Um, what was really bizarre about that is I could see it all. I could see us running through the cabin. I could see us being in that cabin. I could see a can of Coke, and we disappeared. But I could only see myself, my brother, one of my brothers, and my sister. And I'd always believed there were the 4 of us there. After that session, and that's what was unburdened, the fear and the witness of that experience, which was absolutely petrifying for all of us as kids. But after that session, I asked my sister about that. And she recalled the time and how it was scary, and they ran from the cabin and he went and got us a drink. And I asked where my older brother was, because I couldn't, in the image, I understood he was with us. And Helen said, no, he wasn't with us. And so what I found completely profound, I still today think, oh my God, my witnessing was more true than my told memory, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I would, in my witnessing, I was thinking later, I should have had my brother there. Where was my older brother? Because I thought we were all there. But, I was probably only about 5, I think. But so, my system jumped to that to be unburdened. And so I am still left holding the baby in my system. And I visited when was that? Probably a year ago. I can still see the baby. I'm still going to that spot. It's where I turn to. And it was profound. And that Stephanie, in watching it, said to me, it was just, she just said she could see that where he could go, she couldn't. And whether that's because, I guess it's trust, it's system. He was in self. And as I said, because he could see, it's like parts detector. He could seem to detect parts that were me, that were stepping in, that I didn't even know was a part stepping in. I wouldn't have known. So I kept getting thrown out of self, if that makes sense, I think, into my self-like part.
And he was able to pick up on that and ask them to move aside or go to a room or
Yeah. And some of those are like, there'd be a little giggle or a little and he'd ask the part, there's the part again. Can you just step back? It's okay, I've got it. It's like, if I was working with someone, I wouldn't even pick that up as a part. Or a little question or a side. He must have been able to detect every time I was thrown out of self to go into that space to get to that baby, I think.
Sounds like he's quite intuitive and really feels into the space.
Yep.
You know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He can really sense.
Mm.
And I think it's and I just think when his self, it's just so, it's love. It's so, I think he can really, he's just open, intuitive. Maybe that's how it is. Don't know, but I'm forever grateful for that session.
Yeah, I imagine. Yeah.
I'm just feeling
But
a
then
lot of gratitude for you, Heidi, and for you just sharing so personally with us. And I just feel a lot of appreciation for the parts of you that allow that, and the courage to take us through that moment. And I could feel kind of tingling in my spine when you mentioned connecting with your baby self. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah.
I felt so lucky very blessed and lucky to get to the surgeon, really, of the IFS model.
Love that. Heidi, I'm wondering, earlier you mentioned about your spiritual beliefs. And I'm just wondering if you could expand on that a little bit more, and how do your spiritual beliefs make meaning of parts and self?
Well, I guess where I'm going to go with this is probably not so much Indigenous as Christian, really. If that's kind of,
absolutely.
How did it make part? One day when I was early in the piece I was looking for self inside, trying to use a work colleague who's done some IFS. And I thought I was just stopped in my tracks. I was on the phone actually doing that work. And I just found this, I thought it was self, this most beautiful, just calming, tear-wrenching. I couldn't work out what it was, and I thought it was self, but it was later. I actually believe I found the Holy Spirit. So I think as Christians, we have a Holy Spirit, and it's not a part. We're the self. And it's not, I don't believe it's self, even though some would say God is within. And so and I know as a Christian, we promise the Holy Spirit. When we give our heart to the Lord, really, when you take Jesus on, and the Holy Spirit is the one that opens our eyes to the Word, which is quite frustrating because without it, you really can't understand the Bible, which is really frustrating, but it does open the world. And I kind of, and that's where I do, and in a spiritual sense, there's lots of Christian beliefs that will go, oh, is that's, off the path. It's not God, it's not Jesus, it's could be some misled spiritual thing of a new age hippie thing, and that threw past me the idea of that spirituality first, because it is a very spiritual system. But as what many Christians and spiritual people find is, well, it's love. Really, I think, and that's really Christianity is based on lots of spiritual beliefs, and it's a move towards with love. And what the model does is what they say Jesus did during the world to heal people. He moves towards with love and accepts. So I think spiritually, and I think why I was led this way is because of my manager parts and my firefighter parts, I guess, it's been there's only so far you could go in Christian or eat close to God or even people when you've got those barriers up. And it's that stops us living a life wider and broader than you could possibly can. So, does that kind of answer what you were?
Yeah, it does. And I guess what's resonating with me is when you just said it's the managers and the firefighters and our protective system that kind of stops us from deepening. And how, like, what I'm hearing is IFS is the connection point of maybe deepening, to get to know our own protective system, and to move through that.
To me, it's like until you can go in and love yourself and your own parts, the ones that
Yeah.
you do not like or that you
Mm.
hate or that you've repelled or that you've not even connected to, you cannot
Yeah.
do that to others.
Yeah.
You can't, I believe it's
Yeah.
really hard to do that to others. So it's about intimacy and connecting and being real.
Yeah. And I'm just wondering, that brings me on to a question just about Aboriginal beliefs of spirituality and
Yeah.
how does the IFS theory of mind fit in, or does it even fit in? Or, yeah, I'm really curious about that as well.
Well, that's a big question, but I would,
Mm,
in not what I've been taught from handed down by law, LORE, but what I know having sitting in the community and knowing is all of Aboriginal community, Indigenous perspective is it's all parts. We're all parts. We're all part of a big thing.
mm,
So the spirituality weaves from the land, the ocean, the air, the water, the internal, and to the everything. So
mm,
instead of us being so I suppose in a system sense, it's the outside big family system. But in an
mm,
IFS sense, I guess if you go internal,
mm,
it's real for me. It's really hard to know um, that. I mean, it is just Western psychiatry that would say we've got one mind,
mm,
and that's it. Like IFS would say we have many minds or split or
mm.
multiple personalities without
Yeah.
being DID. But
Mm,
I would only be able to presume that Indigenous culture had more than the idea of the one mind,
yeah.
because there were so many facets. And I guess, I mean, when you're a little Aboriginal child, you're taught dance, you're taught song, you're taught place, so you know where you belong in the community. And you
Mm,
know as you grow how your kinship and your network weaves in that community. So again, in your mind, I guess that's what's happening as you learn as well,
yeah.
as if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Makes total sense what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
and with my suicide stuff, I actually did some research about 10 years ago in the community about suicide because we had a project. It's really
mm,
hard to find a word for suicide within Indigenous culture in Australia.
ah,
And
yeah.
in a sense, it's like, did it never happen? Is it another thing that was an invasion or introduced by a Western culture? And in
Yeah.
a sense, because when I've explored that concept, it's because Aboriginal, two things, a collective culture. So we all knew that whatever I do impacts upon everybody else. And I belong to not just me, but everybody. So it's collective. But also, Aboriginal culture had if you did something wrong, there was kind of the shame probably not as bad in that you were either speared or stabbed or you
Mm,
did your time, if that makes sense. There was
mm,
always
mhm.
a place to put it and get rid of it. Whereas
Yep.
in our culture, I think there's a bit more shame. We can push it down, ignore it, and hide it.
Mm,
So therefore, that sense of that depth of those shame stuff might be different. So therefore, that concept of
mm.
feeling not wanting to belong, because it's about connection, it's about disconnection. And Aboriginal culture, from very early on, you are connected to a whole kinship structure, and you really belong.
Yeah.
So maybe it wasn't a concept until you were too old or too you knew that you were going to be a disbenefit to your community.
Mm,
Maybe that was suicide. I don't know.
yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Anyway.
Yeah, but thanks for sharing your views on that. Yeah. I know it's probably a big question that we could
Yes.
chat for a long time on,
mm,
but I'm also conscious we've got other things that we want to
Oh,
ask you.
mm.
all right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it makes me think of another question I wanted to explore with you, Heidi, around this idea that you mentioned in your Welcome to Country, and you mentioned mentioned in your research, is around seeing Australia as a person.
Mm,
And Suzanne and I have had a number of chats, and I think we talked about it with Bob in our last interview as well, around how individual IFS therapy is pretty slow as an approach to heal collective trauma, because it's expensive, as you mentioned earlier. You've got to do lots of one-on-one sessions. And what I'm hearing you say, and tell me if this is wrong, but is this idea that maybe we can heal a larger system. And what you were just talking about there, that, you know, in Indigenous and Aboriginal culture, that people were connected to so much more than themselves, and that there was this kind of collective feeling in families and in kinship groups, and then a collective connection to nature and the wind and the water and the land. I'm just wondering, you know, in your research, or your ideas about your research, can you tell us more about that, and how it could help us perceive Australia as a person, and maybe how that could contribute to kind of a collective healing that we could all experience? I know it's just a concept for you at the moment, but could you just say a bit more about that? Because it sounds hopeful, and I think that this idea of collective healing is really needed in our culture, not just on the individual level.
Yeah. So what I found out is Dick Schwartz does run groups of people to heal racist legacy burdens. And he started to do that. And he talks about how he's done that in mobs of people, like big groups. And so that part of what you said was is possible, I think, to do it in groups. And particularly on racism. You can find a podcast somewhere. Listen to so many, I wouldn't know which one it is that he talks about.
I think that's the one with Darren Young. Darren Young from Black Therapist Rock.
First Rock, yeah. There's a couple of them actually. So, but in terms of what I was trying to do with the project is more look at the IFS lens on a complex problem. And originally it was to be a PA. Well, it was a master's, but it was going to turn into a PhD, because I was going to run it with groups of people, Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal people, showing the lens as a group, and then they look at the manager, the protectors, the exiled, as in exiled Aboriginal, and then look at our country and go, get from them a way to view what's going on here. It's like you could do it with the Yes campaign now, really, couldn't we? But it was more of a different way to, I suppose I was taking it back out to a systems model, which is what IFS was taken from, a systems model, bringing it in. And so it was taking it back out again, but trying to deliver it that way, rather than, and hoping that framework and way of thinking would influence how people make decisions on on problems, and at the country level, which comes from my community psychology as well, actually, because that's what community psychology does, takes tools and applies it to the individual community, country, world. That makes sense.
Yeah, so it's about bringing the IFS framework to a group of people, and then them coming together to decide how a solution could come from that framework. Okay. Wow. And
so a bit like,
go ahead. Yeah.
I was going to say, a bit like we could do that with the Yes campaign and the No campaign, the Voice to Parliament. Like, what is going on there?
Yeah. Would it be
from
okay
an IFS lens?
Would it be okay to ask you about that?
Or I could reflect that to you guys too, if you think what's really going on there.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's so relevant at the moment, isn't it?
What I can add is
go ahead.
when I have done the Voice to Parliament and I've looked at that big level, it really does look like the Voice to Parliament is really another manager system to to Australia, because the problem, really, the foundational problem is national treaty. Australia has been founded against British's own law, terra nullius. And Mabo said that the only way Britain could have taken all this land for nothing is either slaughter everybody, or there was no man's land. And they took it as though there was no one that lived here. And so therefore it became British law. So there's been no treaty. There's been talks of treaty, because under that law, there really needs to be a treaty. Like, it's like our foundation in Australia is a crack right at the beginning. And as any foundational crack, the more years that go by, the higher the building grows or whatever, the crack gets bigger.
Yeah.
So we really do need a national treaty, to be fair,
Yeah.
because we're all stolen land. And Mabo made that clear. We know that, but this voice is one step towards that direction. Voice doesn't say no treaty, it's voice, truth telling, then treaty.
Yeah.
And within the Aboriginal community, my understanding is a lot of people who don't want it within the Aboriginal community is we want treaty. We fully want treaty because it gives, the voice gives no power, and it's probably not going to change closing the gap stuff much because there really is no power.
I guess the difference is that it would be enshrined in the Constitution, which would mean that it couldn't be removed or changed or taken away by successive governments, which has happened so many times with other movements for Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people, where there's been a statement or a path forward to get to treaty, but then another government comes in and it's removed, whereas the voice will have a consistent support for that, hopefully, over time.
That's
and moving
hopefully,
towards
yes.
treaty. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I did want to ask you about that, you know, the Uluru Statement from the Heart you mentioned earlier in the interview. And you said that for you felt like it came from self. And I read it again before this interview to refresh myself. And it's such a respectful and clear statement, and there's so much forgiveness and compassion in it, and it's such an offering to the Australian people to really walk alongside Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to a future where they can be heard, and we can find a way to find a treaty in Makarrata, and also to then tell the truth about what happened in the frontier wars and all of the things that happened in the beginning of colonization. And so I wondered if you just wanted to speak to the Uluru Statement of the Heart any more than what's been said.
I encourage everybody to read it because before they make a decision, yes or no, because as you say, it's such a humble gift to the nation, the way it's written. And it's a beautiful way to basically, it's not blaming anyone. It feels, I don't know, when you feel the voice, they're not attacking, it's not blaming. It's a little bit of a move towards with love and a little bit of help us, please. That's the right thing to do. And so when you read that, it's really hard to imagine why people would want to say no. Really. People do, though. Lots of people.
Yeah, but that's a beautiful suggestion for people, you know, anyone listening. If you haven't read the Uluru Statement from the Heart, find the real document and have a read of it, because it is really significant and from such. And it was decades in the making, and they consulted, you know, all of the different Aboriginal communities around the country, and that was a consensus document. They all came together at Uluru and signed together. So it's worth reading and looking at. And
really, Aboriginal people, the elders of this country, been here so long, and Australia is only a toddler, two years old, you know, like, so the wisdom that sits in the culture is so important for us as a nation to have respect, love, grab, and because what's happening is the impact on all Aboriginal people is only 3% of the population. So yet again, it's the non-Aboriginal people who are going to make the decision for us. In this 2023, Aboriginal people, we still don't have power over if it's going to be a yes or a no, because 97% of Australia are going to be making that decision. But it's also caused conflict within our own little community of our 3%. So that horizontal violence, it's just horrible, really, what it's causing. And then there's so much crap that Aboriginal people carry anyway. You can't walk out your door, you can't watch TV, you can't listen to the radio, you can't go to a conference, you can't go anywhere without the thing in your face.
Yeah.
And so it's divided us as a community, and it's divided, and then and then all the racist stuff that have to listen to, and what people write about and say is horrendous.
Mhm.
So Australia, in a way, should have protected its minority communities, knowing that such a mega impact was going to happen upon this small community of Aboriginal people in the national discussion. Should never have happened, but anyway, it has.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're speaking about the decisive kind of media portrayal of it that's kind of separating us and is really, yeah, hurting communities and local people and Aboriginal people. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what I'm hearing is that you always should have had a voice. Should have been in the
Well,
Constitution. Should have been recognised from the beginning. And that's the pain.
Mhm.
Aboriginal people need a Bill of Rights in this country. That's kind of my belief.
Right.
But that's something
Yeah.
totally different, because we need
Yeah.
protecting.
Yeah.
Mm.
Anyway,
Mm.
that's a whole nother topic.
It is.
Thank you so much,
Yeah.
Heidi, for all you've shared about that. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, it's really appreciated. Yeah. Ollie, I'm just wondering if you have anything else that you want to ask.
Yeah, I'm just noticing the time, and we've covered a lot, and it's been really rich discussion.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is there anything, Heidi, that you'd like us to know and our listeners to know that we haven't asked you yet?
Gee, that's a big one. Oh, my sense is, because this is about IFS, internal family systems, really. Kind of, have we covered enough on internal family systems, was my thought.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah, well, this was about giving you the opportunity to share about what you're passionate about and your experience as a person and as an IFS therapist. Yeah. Is there anything more you want to say about it before we finish? About the approach or the model?
I'd really like you hinted on a bit, to heal the nation, or heal individuals, one by one, is a very slow and very expensive process.
Mm.
So I don't know if it's happening in Australia, but the group stuff, have either of you guys considered doing that?
Yeah, I think we've had
Yeah.
talks about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Sorry,
yeah, it's
Suzanne, you go
been
ahead.
it's been on my mind quite a bit, and even being part of IFS consultation groups and healing groups and having direct experience of healing in a group, and even through our own IFS training and the collective self energy, and the power of that. And I think, with IFS groups, there is somebody in America who that's what he does, Chris Burris. That's solely what he teaches people on. And so I guess, myself and Ollie have had discussions around groups as well. But my intention coming from the background I've come from, people healed in community as well. And I have a real strong hope that, with healing in groups and healing in community, this work can be more accessible to everybody.
Yeah.
And it has less barriers, because I think with, even though one-on-one therapy is very valuable and very useful, we heal in community. Those wounds that we carry are relational.
Yeah.
And we heal in relationship. Yeah, so it's something that I hold very strongly in my own system at the moment. Yeah.
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 Yeah, and just to draw on what you're saying, Suzanne, and something you mentioned before, Heidi, yeah, I'd be very interested if we could bring something like what Dick Schwartz and Darren Young are doing in the States in doing legacy unburdenings of racism and things like that in large groups. I think there's a huge possibility for that in our country. And
yeah, I that reminded me of a country healing idea, and I think it was it Ireland that had the Queen come to it and say sorry for all the wars that were done. And that was probably maybe only about 8 to 10 years ago.
I don't
You
know.
don't know about that history? She came to the Wall of Fallen. Apparently, in your country, you have a Wall of the Fallen, where all the soldiers are.
I actually don't know. I know, I'm really curious.
There's a video on it. I will send you a video on it.
Yeah, please do.
Because
I haven't lived in Ireland in over a decade, so sometimes I don't hear about these things, you know, because I'm somewhere else. But yeah, please send that to me. I'd love to see that. Yeah.
What I thought could really happen to help heal Australia is have the Queen, who is now the King, come out to Australia and say, I am sorry. We as a country knew we sent you all out here. We treated you like crap. That's all the convicts. And we as a country knew what was going on. And even we as a country in the 20s and 1940s, 1960s, we knew how we were treating Aboriginal people as well. And just take some kind of, I'm sorry, we should have known better.
Yeah.
Kind of lead, which may happen if we ever become, a republic? I don't know. But if the convicts and the main Australian get that apology, maybe that will start healing our country.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, they did, these people that settled Australia did get a pretty shit time, didn't they? I mean, and there is one for Ireland, and I will send it to you.
Please do.
I think there's a precedent for that as well, Heidi. I think the Crown has apologised to one of the African nations that it colonised. And that has happened once before in history. I can't remember which country it was.
Wow.
But there has been an apology like that before, but not for Australia, obviously. Yeah.
Wouldn't that be nice if we got one? Because then the main big group of Australia might be able to start treating the Indigenous people better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because they're wound.
Yeah.
And again, that's an IFS framework. It's a move towards with love.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And witnessing all those people with their generations of convicts, all that story would be witnessed and acknowledged and held and apologized to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So Heidi, if I'm just wondering, if people want to get in touch with you directly, how would you like them to connect with you?
Email, maybe. It's probably the easiest way.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, and we can leave a note of your email if that's the best way for people to get in touch. Have you got a website or any other way? No, just email is best for you. Yeah.
It's best for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, we can post that in the show notes, or if people want to get in touch with Heidi, they can get in touch with us, and we can forward that on.
Cool.
Yeah.
Heidi, I just want to extend all of my appreciation and acknowledgement to you for coming and talking to us about, such tender topics in the world that we live in. And thank you to all our listeners as well who come and listen to, what you've got to say and being here with us. Yeah, so I really just want to acknowledge that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
thank you for the invite. I feel
Yeah,
humbled.
you're so welcome.
Yeah.
You're so welcome.
you. Yeah.
And I just want to check as well, just with both of you, you know, how are your parts going now that we're coming to a close?
A bit sad, but also a bit.
Mm, mm, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. I also feel a little bit of sadness. I feel a huge amount of appreciation too, just for this
yeah,
conversation and this opportunity. And I think there's some really, there's some really hopeful things that we've talked about. And I really look forward. I hope we all collaborate in some way in the future and have another conversation like this. And it's been a blessing. So thank you, Heidi.
yeah,
Thank you, Suzanne.
yeah.
Oh,
Thank you all. Thank you both.
I also want to say I was very excited when I saw your first podcast because I thought,
Yeah,
yay, Australia's going to have one because we don't
yeah,
really have one. But, we blitz on all the others, like an IFS podcast talk thing. It's great.
yeah,
Keep it up. Keep it
yeah,
up.
Great.
yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Bye all.
Bye.